This is my final case study for EDL 850. Just a quick summation of events. So a rural school has been fundraising to supplement their small budget. The efforts were successful. They got a new computer lab and software. So everybody was well receiving the software. They asked the library media specialist, Mrs. Lynn, to make and distribute copies so they could use it on the computers in their classrooms. It is unknown if the requesting teachers knew that this was a violation of Copyright Act. So Mrs. Lynn agreed without she didn't consult anyone else in advance. She just started doing it. She ordered blank CDs, I'm assuming with school funds, and began to make and distribute the copies. Okay, so she gets to the 3rd grade, distributes 2 copies. The senior teacher happily accepts the materials. The new teacher, Mrs. Brandon, had an issue with the copying of software, and this had come from her experience at her previous school. So Mrs. Brandon took her complaint or her concern to Mr. Sample's office, the principal, to express concerns with the actions of Mrs. Lynn, and she explained some of the things that had been going on in her previous school. So Mr. Sample had a few questions, the number of copies that were made, and by best guesstimate, there were about 24 copies floating around right now. So having this knowledge could possibly make Mrs. Brandon and Mr. Sample accessories to the crime of copyright infringement, or they could be accused of aiding and abetting. So Mr. Sample confronted Mrs. Lynn the following day. She held to her belief that she is saving the school money. He did commend her resourcefulness, but reminded her that she is violating copyright law. She seems to have only been in contact with the PTA president, Mrs. Evans, and Mrs. Evans is not a school official and is actually now an accomplice because she had been volunteering in the library to make the copies. So the parties involved were Mrs. Lynn, Mrs. Brandon, Mrs. Williams, Mr. Sample, and Mrs. Evans, and any of those other 4 unnamed teachers who may or may not have accepted the copyrighted software or the copied software. So you got legal and ethical issues in this case. Legally, you have federal copyright. Then you have the more specific software copyright and licensing that came with the software. And you have federal aiding and abetting charges that could apply as well. Ethically, you have the use of school equipment, time, and funds for illegal activities. You have people who are going along with an illegal activity either to maintain the status quo, or in, I feel, possibly the case of the principal, status elevatum. Like he doesn't want to lose any of the popularity that he's gained over the last 3 years. The other ethical issue I have is they're not respecting the authority of the principal. They are basically, I feel like, putting the PTA above the principal in this case. So in a nutshell, the event is that Mrs. Lynn put herself, the school district, the school, the principal, the 6 teachers who received copied material, and the PTA president at risk for federal copyright infringement, software license misuse, and federal aiding and abetting charges. Facts. Mrs. Lynn knowingly made and distributed copies of copyrighted material. We know that. Mrs. Williams received the materials. It is unknown how many of the other teachers accepted the materials. We know that Mrs. Brandon did not. But there are other teachers involved as well in those 3 grades. And once Mr. Sample is informed of the event, he becomes an accessory. So he needs to take some sort of action. And the same is true for Mrs. Brandon. As far as the place, the material was copied using St. Regis property and was done on the premises. Don't know if it was done during school hours, but that could be thrown in there as well. And regardless of rural location, copyright law still applies, contrary to Ms. Lynn's statement. The materials are distributed to second, third, and fourth grade teachers. We know that. And the PTA president was involved in the process, which could involve the PTA as a program. Um, when we prioritize the issues that could happen, most of the largest offense is copyright infringement, and it can carry fines of between $200,000 to $150,000 per offense, and that is if it's not deemed fair use. So fair use considers the purpose of the use, the nature of the work, the amount taken, and the effect of the use on the market for work. So in this case, I don't feel like fair use applies because they are copying the software in its entirety, and it is affecting the market. Uh, so fines could be imposed on the school district, the school itself, and each of the individuals. So if the purpose of copying the material was to stretch the budget, there's clearly not room in the budget for legal fees and fines. Next, we have the software licensing infringement, which can also carry heavy fines. I found out that there are whistleblower rewards of up to $50,000 for reporting unlicensed use of software. And this does not have anything to do with the size. Big school, big business, little business. A complaint can result in a complete software audit. And in this particular case, that would probably have a terrible outcome because I feel like this is a process that has been going on for a long time. Aiding and abetting does pertain to copyright law. Since basically whoever commits an offense against the United States or aids, abets, counsels, commands, induces, or procures its commission is punishable as a principal. So everybody who is part of this is just as punishable as the library media specialist who did the copying herself. Okay, so as the principal in this case, I identify the following possible consequences. First of all, I feel that taking no action is not an option in this case, right? So I've already been informed, I'm now involved. But as far as a legal action, I feel like that would be a last result. We want to find a fair and equitable solution for this problem. I would go with the most liberal action, would be to take what was outlined in the case study, compliment Mrs. Lynn on her resourcefulness, but remind her that she is violating copyright and must cease and desist the copying practice and collect and destroy the existing copies. That action was met with disregard and respect at first. I would talk to her again and offer her opportunities to learn shareable resources. There would be an option of not renewing her contract, which would have a bad effect on myself, the principal, who is finally making headway in the community. And there would be a case for immediate suspension or dismissal, which would also have a bad effect for me, the principal. Legal action would change a lot of lives for the worse, and we want to support teachers. So that's a con. Not renewing her contract would be a con. It would change the relationship of myself, the principal, with the faculty. You don't want them to be in an environment of fear. The same way with immediate suspension or dismissal. You know, her remark was rude, but I don't think it was insubordinate. The pros, if you're setting an example of firm tolerance, that would not harm anyone. It would actually remedy an actual problem, and copyright infringement is an actual problem that they have to remedy. A less severe line of action would open discussion of legal ways to access resources within the budget and save the school district money as we explore free or legally shareable resources. So as I go to choose the best option, I just ask several questions. Is this an isolated incident? Do we need to review our policies? Do we even have policies? Do we need to implement policies? Do I avoid harsh action to maintain the rapport that I have established with the faculty and community? Do I believe that malice was involved? No. Do I feel disrespected by Miss Lynn's initial response? Yes. Do we give her a second chance to maybe give a better response? Yes. What is the best course of action for all stakeholders? And the stakeholders need to be aware, stakeholders including the PTA and all of the other teachers, of the penalties for copyright infringement. So, have I had this discussion? Did the stakeholders have anything to add? Have I explored all options? How can we inspire our staff to pursue new creative approaches to this budget issue? And this needs to be something that we work collaboratively with all the stakeholders involved. And what is the best way to address all of these questions while still making academic success our #1 goal? Okay, so my decision would be implemented by a tactful conversation with all stakeholders. First, I'm choosing the more liberal action, a team effort. So although the initial conversation didn't go well, I would insist that the copies be collected and destroyed. Reminder that the size of the school has nothing to do with it, and that they actually do care that a small school is doing this. And I would explain that I want everyone to feel comfortable in their work environment. So Mrs. Lynn's actions were making Mrs. Brandon uncomfortable in her work environment. So she knew that that copyright was wrong. Second, I would explain all the legal ramifications and inform her of this whistleblower issue in case she didn't know, and how she's leaving us all exposed. I would present this information also to stakeholders at professional development or some other venue, and we would all approach it as a team. Next, I would talk about the allocation and management of resources and how to construct policies consistent with the law that will support both students and faculty. Okay. Last, I would suggest taking some of the fundraising money to send her to a workshop where she could learn about copyright and free resources, and this would give her and others opportunity to share knowledge with the stakeholders that might actually end up saving the district more money than making illegal copies, which leaves us out there liable for fines and legal action.